Okay. You can go whenever I'm recording.
Okay. Well, welcome back, everybody. Happy New Year to everyone. This is our first brown bag of the year, of the decade. And we are honored to have Todd Glover here from GSE. And thank you all for making it down this way. We should be back upstairs next week, but there's a little construction going on with noise. Okay, so Todd is an educational psychologist. He's at GSE, as I mentioned. And he has done a lot of work and continues to do a lot of work looking at essentially educational interventions. He's done a lot of work in response to interventions. He has really tried to focus on professional development and school reform. And so he's got a robust research agenda. He's tremendously active. He got his degree at the University of Wisconsin. He spent quite a number of years at the University of Nebraska. And it's just a pleasure to have him here. And one of the ways I connected to him is that his wife actually shared an office or a library with my wife last year, and she kept saying, "Oh, you gotta meet this guy," which we did, and so it's been a real pleasure. So thanks so much for coming, Todd.
Great.
And look forward to it.
Thanks a lot for having me. And actually, my wife is mentioned that she refers to her office. She's a speech language pathologist, and she refers to her office as kind of the closet at the library. So her office was in the closet, I guess, working with your wife is the way she put it. But thank you very much for inviting me. Yeah, my name is Todd Glover. I'm from GSE. I'm an associate research professor here, so I'm externally funded through my own grants. So I do a lot of grant writing for federal grants, primarily with the U.S. Department of Education. Most of my work is funded by the U.S. Department of Ed. I also have some state contracts with different states. And so what I'll be talking about today is based on some of my work that's funded through these projects. And so I'll initially start out with some kind of practical information around MTSS and early reading and some of the work that I've done through implementation projects that I've designed and worked in collaboration with state departments of ed to implement around MTSS and early reading. So it's very practical kind of nuts and bolts around MTSS and coaching for MTSS. And then I'll turn to some of the research that I've done funded by the U.S. Department of Ed that's looking at aspects of MTSS implementation and support through coaching in MTSS. So my talk is on coaching school personnel to implement multi-tiered systems of support in early reading. For those that many of you are probably familiar with MTSS or multi-tiered systems of support. And, increased popularity over the last 30 years or so. There's a lot of kind of recognition of this as a model for helping support students early on with academics or behavior difficulties and offering tiered continuum of supports for students. Although it's been around and it's popular, the degree to which it's implemented effectively varies quite a bit from district to district or even within schools or across schools within districts. And so as you look at the research literature and my own work, I see going from one building to the next, it can look quite different. And so one of the important things to consider when we implement these multi-tiered systems is ways of supporting school stakeholders so they can coordinate them so they're delivering components of MTSS with fidelity. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. I mostly just mentioned this, but again, I'll start out with kind of going over the justification for MTSS and early reading. I'll talk about coaching utilizing a data-driven coaching model that I've developed with some of my colleagues, and I'll give some examples from some of the work I do with the U.S. Department of Ed implementation project in this area, and then I'll talk about research, an IES-funded research study on MTSS. So we look at multi-tiered system supports in schools. I'm sure many of you have seen it depicted as a triangle, and we think about at the foundation of multi-tiered supports is kind of tier one or core instruction. So when we think about tier one supports for early reading, that's really the reading instruction that takes place typically during an ELA block. It's the reading instruction that all kids get in school. So it's provided to all students. And then tier 2 is really supports that are offered to students for whom tier 1 is sufficient to meet the majority of their needs. They need some extra help. They receive support in small groups, typically interventions. And then tier 3 is more intensive, individualized interventions that are provided to students for whom tier 1 and tier 2 are insufficient in meeting their needs. So within this and I'm sure many of you are familiar with the multi-tiered approach, but within this multi-tiered model, data play a really critical role in informing decisions within systems. And so student data, using universal screening data on students to identify students' performance relative to some benchmarks to help determine how well is core meeting majority of students' needs and which students may benefit from some additional support beyond core instruction. Diagnostic data are used to follow up to provide information about student skill needs for students who fall below benchmarks, to help group students with similar needs for tier 2, tier 3 intervention. And then progress monitoring data are often collected to help look at students' progress over time in response to receiving that tier 2 or tier 3 intervention. And then there's a research literature on database decision roles that can be applied to this progress monitoring data to make reliable and valid decisions about whether students are adequately responding to intervention. So that data use is a really critical piece of MTSS and early reading. The other thing that's a really critical piece is the continuum of research-based practices at each tier. So we think about the practices that occur along a continuum across these tiers. It's important that they have kind of a common scope and sequence that's designed to help support those efforts across the tiers so that they make sense and coordinate with one another. And then the last piece is around leadership. So we think about MTSS models in early reading. Leadership is a really critical component of this because an MTSS support model is not a program or a practice. It's a model that supports a system. And so it involves participation of multiple stakeholders within a school. Folks involve schools leaders like superintendents, principals, directors of curriculum, others, people service directors, as well as those that are in classrooms supporting students and making decisions on how to support students. And so those leadership teams are really critical to implementing MTSS as we think about within an MTSS system in early reading, systematic district and school level leadership and coordinate across entities that traditionally may not have coordinated with one another. Folks like in general ed classrooms with special educators working together to support students' needs on a continuum. So we look at the efficacy of MTSS and the components of the MTSS process. We look at the individual components. There's a fair amount of emerging literature supporting the efficacy of different components of MTSS. So the literature on universal screening has found that we can find some fairly reliable early indicators of students' performance that are predictive of their later reading risk. And so we have quite a few studies looking at early screening accuracy. There's research on kind of core program implementation, tier 2 intervention implementation, showing that practices can indeed support students' increases in early reading skills. And then there's emerging research literature on kind of the reliability and the utility of database decision-making rules or criteria in which we can use multiple data points to reliably make decisions about whether students are responding to interventions. So we look at individual components. There's a fair amount of emerging research supporting their efficacy. However, when we look at the efficacy of the MTSS approach as a whole in supporting students in early reading, the literature is not quite as promising. And in fact, in 2016, a group of folks funded through IES that conducted a regression discontinuity design study with about 140, 150 schools across the US that were implementing early reading MTSS and looked at kind of the efficacy of that process, or that model, in terms of improving teacher practice as well as student outcomes. And while they found that there were benefits in terms of improving teacher practice, the outcomes for students were more variable. And so there's quite a bit of conversation about why this was the case. And this particular study that was conducted involved schools implementing what they called RTI reading, MTSS, and early reading supports based on what they've been doing in the past. And so each school was doing slightly different things. So there's a lot of variability in terms of what was going on within the schools. And I can speak to that in my own work and my own practical experience too, that when we meet with schools, there's often in some cases, a lack of application knowledge and skills among some practitioners. So knowing, for example, how to apply systematically database decision rules that are based on research. Classroom teachers are always trained in how to do things like that. And having poor application of specific components of MTSS. So in some cases, we've seen, for example, in some districts where districts are using, say, achievement tests to screen students. Achievement tests aren't designed for that purpose. They don't have a lot of utility for that purpose. And so applying things within that framework in ways that don't necessarily end up benefiting practitioners or students. And so often there's more attention to the framework of MTSS than the specifics. Implementation is a complex process, as you know. It's not like we just take this research-based MTSS and we drop it in districts and we adopt it and we implement it. Instead, it really requires a lot of job-embedded support. And so part of this is working, as I mentioned, with different stakeholders or leaders in schools to coordinate their efforts in ways where there's clear communication about the use of data, about collection of data, applying the data to make instructional decisions, implementing effective instruction in classrooms. So there are a lot of pieces to this. And so coaching is one means of providing job-embedded support in schools. And when we look at the research on instructional coaching, there are really many different variations of instructional coaching. So there are things like peer coaching, there's cognitive coaching, web-based coaching, problem-solving coaching, technical coaching. You're probably aware of other different forms of coaching that occur in schools. Most of these approaches, however, are under research, and there's a fair amount of variability in terms of how they fare in different contexts. Kraft and his colleagues did a meta-analysis of instructional coaching from the education world. Meta-analysis of about 60 causal research design studies. So these were studies, kind of high inference research design studies. And found that there were moderate effects for teachers or interventionists as a result of participating in coaching. Yet the pooled effect sizes yield small effects, unfortunately, on student outcomes. And so oftentimes, people question, well, why does this coaching not result in outcomes for students? And my hypothesis is the devil's really in the details. Who and what is targeted during coaching and how that coaching is conducted. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work that we do in this area. My colleagues and I have developed a data-driven coaching model, and it's really an offshoot of work that I've done in the past. Sue Sheridan, who was at the University of Nebraska, I was previously at the University of Nebraska, who has a long history of work in behavioral consultation. She and her former advisor one time, Tom Cradle and Bergen, had this behavioral consultation model, which is for over 30 years, people have used this as kind of a consultation approach for working with school stakeholders. And so this data-driven coaching model is kind of an offshoot of that consultation approach. It's guided by principles of behavioral and social learning theory, which says that we acquire new skills, we refine them, and we maintain them over time through practice and monitoring and receiving reinforcement that's contingent on us doing desired behaviors or desired practices within the classroom or school setting. So consultation or coaching from this framework involves kind of understanding and arranging environmental conditions in ways that so that effective practices are supported and reinforced in the classroom. Another aspect of this data-driven coaching model is that it's based on a database decision-making framework. And this is also borrowed from kind of the behavioral consultation literature, which is a very student data-centric approach. As you can imagine, it's this data-driven coaching model. So it's very data-centric. It starts with using student data to identify potential student needs, analyzing that data to identify potential mechanisms responsible for students' performance, setting goals based on benchmarks that we have for students, implementing plans of action to address those goals, and then monitoring or evaluating the implementation of those particular practices by monitoring the implementation that's going on in school as well as students' performance over time. And through that evaluation, then identifying new needs and then cycling back through kind of this problem-solving process that's driven by data. So I'm going to shift a little bit to this data-driven coaching model and how it's applied to MTSS in early reading. So when we think about this data-driven coaching model and who is coached, and I'll present kind of the framework, and then I'll talk about work that I'm doing here as part of the implementation effort in New Jersey. It's funded through a U.S. Department of Ed grant. So when we think about who's coached through data-driven coaching for MTSS, it's not only those that are on the front line working with students and supporting students, classroom teachers, and support staff that are involved in instruction and making data decisions about students, but it's also focused on the district and school leadership teams. So a big component of data-driven coaching is very team-based and working with teams of individuals to build kind of a collective communication within schools so that there's an understanding around their role, their respective roles as these pieces of the system come together. And so that includes, as I mentioned, these leaders that are in schools that are able to make decisions about how resources are allocated, about how time's spent, about what priorities are within the districts or schools, as well as those that have practical experience using practices within the classroom, are familiar with particular practices and use of data and how those can inform our support for students. And so that's the focus of that's who's targeted during the coaching. And then what we target during this data-driven coaching for MTSS is support around collecting and using student data. I already mentioned the types of data that are really critical in an MTSS system. Support around implementing research-based practices within each of these tiers, and then support around strong leadership to help orchestrate the coordination of these different components of MTSS. And so, and that often is necessary in order to, that coaching helps hold the school stakeholders accountable for making sure that different pieces of the MTSS system are in place and implemented appropriately, and ensure that appropriate resources are allocated so we can actually achieve what we want to through these multi-tier systems. There's really surprisingly little research when we look at instructional coaching or even team-based coaching in terms of which components of coaching are really the most important components. So very few components analysis of coaching in the literature. Although my colleague Linda Reddy and I have done a series of studies, I'm not going to talk, this is not the focus of my talk today, but I'll give you kind of a couple of the punchlines from our work. And that's, we've looked at some of the various components of coaching models and those that were most predictive of fidelity in terms of implementation of research-based practices within the classroom by practitioners, as well as those are most predictive of student outcomes. And what we found in some of this work was that there were three really primary coaching actions that were really critical and stood out as key predictors. And those were providing modeling during coaching, so the coach was modeling for those that they were coaching, particular practices, particular skills, and how to implement those skills. Providing opportunities for those that were coached to practice those skills, and then providing feedback to those that they coached. So those are modeling, facilitate practice, and feedback were kind of those three primary pieces of the coaching process. So when we think about MTSS and providing data-driven coaching for MTSS and early reading, the emphasis on specific coaching foci really varies depending on a stakeholder's role within a district or a school. But those three research-based actions are almost always included in coaching interactions. And that includes, again, those modeling, facilitated practice, and feedback. And then we provide, again, regular support through leadership teams and within an MTSS support framework. And I'll show you now an example of what we're doing in New Jersey. Typically, those leadership teams meet regularly. So it's like twice a month they'll meet, they'll talk about the system and the components of the system and their roles and engage in action planning. And then there'll be individual sessions with folks, both from those leadership teams and other folks, teachers, interventionists in the school that receive coaching support outside of those regular meetings as well. So that's kind of how it's structured. So I'm going to turn now to the work that we're doing, and this is a U.S. Department of Ed implementation grant that I got along with a colleague from the New Jersey Department of Ed. So I lead the Rutgers side, and she leads the NJDOE side, and we're providing statewide training, coaching support through state-level coaches that are external to the schools in district leadership team support around MTSS and early reading. We're working with 30 school districts and the schools that are within those districts. And it's all up and down the state, different parts of the state. So I'll use this as an example to show how this coaching model plays out in the work that we're doing, and then I'll turn a little bit to the research. It's very hands-on. You get the practice and then the research. Usually the other way around. So the coaching that we're providing as part of this implementation grant is in many different areas pertaining to MTSS. I'm going to focus on these 4 main areas because I don't have time to go into each area. These are kind of the big ones. The first area in which we focus coaching is around universal screening and diagnostic assessments. The second area of coaching we focus on is around research-based instruction that's embedded within each of the tiers of the model. We focus on coaching on data-based instructional decision-making, and then coaching on engagement in the collaborative problem-solving process, engagement with team members in collaborative problem-solving through this model. So I'll go through each of these and kind of give you some examples of what this looks like before I talk about the research. So with universal screening and diagnostic assessment, coaches work with leadership team members to determine the appropriateness of the assessments they're using for the purpose of universal screening. And so oftentimes when we work with districts, there's quite a bit of time spent talking about the functions of assessment, that not all assessments are good for every purpose. And oftentimes we start kind of at the ground level and kind of inventorying the assessment practices that are occurring around early reading in schools and districts, and decide how are you using each of these assessments, or were they really intended for that purpose? And so when we look at screeners, some of the things that our state level coaches focus on through those coaching interactions is determining the technical approach, appropriateness of those screening approaches for the purpose of screening. And so for screening, that involves making sure first, just like any assessment, that they're reliable, there's inter-score reliability, the test-retest reliability. But for screeners, there's a really important piece, which is the predictive utility of those screeners. Do they have evidence of predictive validity? Is there evidence that they can help classify students early on using indicators that will later be found to be at risk in reading? Because in early reading, we want to catch kids early on. And so we spend quite a bit of time in this coaching process with looking at whether the indicators that schools use as part of the universal screening have evidence that they're predictive of later reading performance. And so that in the area of early reading, that involves things like looking at things like phoneme segmenting, being able to hear sounds and words, nonsense word fluency, measure phonics, alphabetic principle, oral reading fluency measure, being able to read connected text. Those have been found in literature to be predictive of later reading performance. And so we work with schools to help ensure that the screeners that are being used kind of have these characteristics associated with them. We then help support schools in making sure that any changes to screening approaches are made as they're needed. And then the other piece we do is we evaluate and we support the alignment between any diagnostic tools that are being used and the scope and sequence of instruction that's occurring within the schools or districts. And so one important thing, and we think about when we provide universal screening, that's provided to all students. You're looking at students' performance relative to these benchmarks. When students fall below benchmarks, then typically as part of an MTSS process, we'll do some sort of skills inventory or diagnostic process with those students to determine where their particular skill needs. And so to make sure that process is useful, it's important to make sure that the diagnostics that are assessed are aligned to the scope and sequence of the curriculum and the instruction that's taking place within the district, within the schools. And so having that alignment can help make sure that any results from those diagnostics can then be used to determine, okay, Johnny's in the middle of kindergarten. What are the expectations for the middle of kindergarten based on our scope and sequence? Here's Johnny's performance. Does he need extra support? That type of thing. So the alignment between those diagnostics and the scope and sequence is a big focus for coaching. I have a couple tools we use. So some screenshots, some tools we use. So some tools you help them to map their screening instruments. So along the top, you can't see here, but there's some early indicators of potential risk. These are predictive of later reading performance. Down the left side is grade levels and different times of year. And then in this matrix, they would input what indicators they're using to measure these different predictors over time. We have a universal screening checklist that's used to kind of assess the different aspects of the universal screener. First, is it brief? You don't want a universal screening process that takes weeks. It takes away from instructional time. So we have a number of different factors in there they use to help assess whether or not that screener is appropriate, whether it's brief, whether or not it's available, easy to administer the score. There's kind of reliability in the scoring process, whether it has predictive validity. We talked about that before. So coaching around that universal screening and diagnostic assessment involves modeling, and typically what we do is the state level coach will work with the district team and sometimes select members of those teams that are responsible for making data-based decisions. Sometimes they're data folks within the district, sometimes those are interventionists, sometimes there's a team of folks, and usually it's a problem-solving team that's in the district, and we work with those teams. We'll take a sample classroom, and those coaches will model with that sample classroom how to apply the screening data, how to make sense, how to analyze those screening data, make sense about whether core instruction is effective, students' individual needs, and how to then apply diagnostic tools to help group students with common needs. And then they'll provide opportunities for facilitated practice. So as they're involved, we'll get some sample classroom data, they'll sit down and they'll walk through that process, they'll analyze it, and the coach will give them real-time feedback in terms of some of their data interpretations and whether they're aligned with kind of best practice from the research. So that's universal screening and diagnostic assessment. The second area in which we provide coaching is around research-based instruction that occurs in each tier. This is obviously a huge area, so I'll just touch on some of the things that we do. But that involves initially coaches working with leadership team members to evaluate practices in each tier, determine whether they're research-based, to help ensure that practices in each tier are aligned again to that scope and sequence, so that the continuity of support that's offered to students makes sense from the perspective of their scope and sequence of their curriculum, and to help ensure that tier 2 and tier 3 support, there's sufficient intensity of support that's offered to students to meet the needs that are identified within the district. So that process typically begins with coaches evaluating and supporting the use of research-based instructional components. So when we look at the instructional literature, some of those key components that constitute good classroom instruction, things like offering opportunities to review previous skills, introducing skills in small steps, modeling particular skills for students, providing them lots of questions with opportunities to respond, giving some guided practice with scaffolding, having time for independent practice and checks for understanding. So some of those kind of research-based instructional practices, coaches work with those school teams to review their curricula, to review their lesson plans for the presence of these kind of research-based instructional components. And then they support the process of aligning instruction in each tier to, again, a well-defined scope and sequence. So for example, in the area of phonemic awareness, which is being able to hear sounds and spoken words. We start out by being able to isolate individual phonemes and words, and then we progress to being able to segment or blend phonemes that we hear in words, to being able to then manipulate phonemes, swap them out with other phonemes to make new words. And so this progression is one that makes logical sense. And so we look through each of those kind of skills within reading, those big 5 reading areas: phonological awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension, to review with the school leadership teams to make sure the scope and sequencing of the skills that are introduced are consistent with what we know about that skills progression. So we have a number of tools that are used to do this. Again, there's a core intervention analysis tool, there's lesson plan templates that are used to help guide this process of looking for research-based components within the instruction and interventions provided in each tier. We have curriculum mapping templates that are used, which assist districts in outlining kind of the sequencing of skills that are provided during early reading skill instruction, and then mapping their curriculum and their instruction to those skills so that it's logical in terms of the types of supports they need to be able to teach each of those skills, and there's communication among school stakeholders about which curricula and which instruction is used for which skills at each tier. And then we have classroom observation protocols too that are used to help monitor and look for some of those research-based aspects of instruction, whether they're present in the classroom, and giving the teachers and interventions feedback through that process. So coaching involves kind of modeling the use of these tools with their curriculum, with their instruction, with their lesson planning, with their classroom observations. And then offering times for facilitated practice for school stakeholders to then in turn expand upon these tools. So typically the way it would work is we'd start with our external coaches. They come in, they help support the use of, say, intervention analysis tool and say the curriculum mapping templates with, say, select skills within a certain grade level. And then the school teams will work on building that out, and the coach will give them feedback on making revisions and adjustments over time. So they get a lot of feedback. Initially it's modeled, but then get feedback on their opportunity to practice that and enact it within their school. The third area in which we provide coaching support is around data-based instructional decision making. So we talked a little bit about collecting, screening, and diagnostic data. It's then important, what do you do with that data? And supporting schools and making sure that they're using best practice that we know from the research literature in terms of applying the research and making data-based decisions. And so they support leadership team members in using data to evaluate the effectiveness of core instruction. So whether or not core instruction meeting the majority of students' needs. And so looking at, with these universal screening data, do we have anywhere near, say, 80% of students making those reading benchmarks? If we don't, we might need to think about adjusting our core system in the school before we overload all these interventionists with these intervention cases. And so using those data to make decisions about core instruction, but then also using screening data to help guide the need for additional interventions for certain students. So students whose scores fall below benchmark, and following that up with the use of some diagnostic data to group students who have similar needs for intervention, so to support them in grouping students based on their individual performance. And then our coaches provide support in applying research-based methods for determining students' response to intervention. So students who are receiving tier 2 or tier 3 intervention, which are many from the response to intervention literature that's out there, and being able to make some reliable decisions from those data about whether students are responding from intervention requires understanding and knowing how to apply certain criteria. And so things like being able to establish a goal line with which to compare the trend in students' performance. And do we use normative data to establish this goal line? Or do we use some sort of end of semester benchmark to establish this goal line, using some research-based practice around setting that goal line, as well as practices for determining how to use multiple data points to identify a trend. So do we look at the last data point in the trend? Do we consider the last 3? Do we look at the time from their baseline to where they are now? How do we make sense of data in ways that are reliable and valid based on what we know from the research? And so coaches provide support in that areas. So there's some tools to help support this work. In New Jersey, through this implementation grant, our state level coaches utilize templates to help with evaluating the impact of core instruction, identify students for intervention. And then there are also templates for helping assist districts in monitoring students' progress and making intervention decisions based on students' progress. So coaching around data-based instructional decision-making involves modeling the use of data from the classroom to help make decisions, again, about the core effectiveness as well as the appropriateness of intervention for particular students. That modeling typically takes place by a coach with like a select classroom. So we'll pick let's say we'll pick one first grade classroom, we'll work with a school team, and we'll go over that classroom, we'll talk about the decisions that were made from screening data and the diagnostic data, and here's how we group students, we'll model that, and then we'll have opportunities for them to practice that with other classrooms and receive feedback from their coach based on that practice. The last piece I'll talk about, and then I'll jump into some of the research that we're doing, is coaching that's taking place as part of this implementation work here in New Jersey on engagement in the collaborative problem-solving process. And so, as I mentioned, and it's really a cornerstone of MTSS, is that it's driven by district and school level leadership teams. Again, it requires coordination among a lot of different stakeholders within schools to be able to pull off the system of support. And so part of that, the coaches work with those leadership team members to utilize some action planning templates. And so we have templates and formal protocols that we've developed that they can use to indicate for these different components of the MTSS process, who's responsible for managing those aspects, who's responsible for particular actions that are needed to better put things in place for those components, and by when does that need to occur. And then the coaching for this involves modeling the use of these action planning templates, and then providing them opportunities to refine the templates based on some of their local needs, and giving them feedback based on their adherence to the action plans that they've developed within the districts to help hold them accountable for their actions around MTSS. So that's a quick run through of some of the implementation work we're doing, and that's kind of gives you a sense of what I'm talking about when I say kind of data-driven coaching for MTSS and early reading. I'm going to turn now to, I've been told kind of the whole discussion to the end, but if you have questions, feel free to jump in. Any questions about the implementation work before I jump into the research? Yeah.
I was just, like, as you were talking, I was thinking about my experience as a fourth grade teacher. And I remember being told, like, given some material and being, like, told to identify the 3, I guess, like, lowest readers in the class that weren't already receiving special education support, and then start doing progress monitoring with them, and, like, was given a program to do with them. But none of it was clear to me, and I feel like, well, I guess I'm just wondering, why do the coaches not do professional development with the teachers? Mm-hmm. It seems like too much middlemen in right. between. Like right. a principal usually hasn't taught in a really long time.
Right,
and
right.
kind of doesn't even really know what's going on in the classroom anymore. So it just feels like these stakeholders aren't really the people on the ground, like doing the work. So I'm just wondering why the people who are like experts in this aren't doing professional development with the teachers.
Sure. That's a very good question. In fact, I was remiss to mention that as part of this work too, there's workshop-based institutes that we offer to different stakeholders as part of this to help build foundational knowledge before the coaching takes place. And I should have included that inside there. It's a really important piece to that. And I'll show you an example of how that played out in this research study too. But I do want to say as part of those leadership teams, it's not just principals and superintendents and directors of curriculum. There are also classroom teachers that are in there. There are interventionists, there are support personnel, there are data folks that are part of those leadership teams. And they have an important role too in kind of supporting others that are around them too. So it's not just in the work that we're doing is primarily external coaches. But the piece I didn't have time to kind of get into our sustainability work that we do. But we do this initial coaching work, and then in kind of the latter years of our coaching in the systems work, we train those teams to make sure they have internal coaching capacity. And so that would necessitate that teachers that are on those leadership teams are able to then in turn be coaches for other teachers who are doing some of this work. So it's a combination of both kind of workshop-based professional development and then folks that are trained by coaches to then in turn coach others around them as well. That's a good point. Okay, I'm going to shift a little bit now, shift gears and give you a research example from some of my early ones. So this is, I'll talk about Project Readers, which stands for Response to Effective Assessment-Driven Early Reading Supports. We actually found an acronym that worked. It took a couple weeks, but we got it. And this is work that I did. I led this work. It was an IES-funded randomized trial that we did on a portion of the MTSS process. It looked at database decision-making that was used to guide Tier 2 intervention supports in early reading in kindergarten through 3rd grade. And so it's not the whole system, it's a portion of the system. That's what I'll be talking about here in this work. I conducted this work along with a colleague, Tanya Ilo, who was at the University of Nebraska at the time. She's now at UNC Chapel Hill. And Edward Shapiro, who was unfortunately passed away, but he was at Lehigh University. He was a great partner in this part of this work as well. So this research example involves, again, it's a professional development approach we were looking at that involved on-site institute trainings to get some of the things you were saying, which is important that we train, had some, that those that were participating in this coaching had foundational knowledge about early reading, about early assessment practices, so they weren't always having to learn on the fly through the coaching process. So there was a combination between on-site institute trainings and then this was a unique study, and that we were working with schools in the Midwest and the Northeast that were primarily rural schools. And so we wanted to capitalize on the expertise of some really great coaches, but they didn't necessarily have to be there on site. And so it was a web facilitated coaching that took place via web conferencing with the stakeholders in real time that were within each of these districts that participated. And so, and our focus again was on database decision making and implementation of tier 2 reading interventions. So it's not the whole MTSS system. And our focus on the training and the institute training and the coaching was on supporting teachers and interventionists. And within this work, the teachers were instrumental in making database decisions. The interventionists were instrumental in implementing the interventions the students needed, tier 2 type of reading interventions. Again, this is kindergarten through 3rd grade. It was a big project. There were lots of folks involved. We had 2 project managers, one that was in the Midwest, one that was in the Northeast. We had 6 external coaches that provided this coaching to schools that were participating in the study. We had coaching consultants that regularly monitored, because all the coaching took place via web conferencing, we had video of all the coaching sessions, which was really cool. So it was a great data set to be able to mine that data for information about coaching. And we would code that regularly, select intervention sessions or coaching sessions, so that we had coaching consultants that can again give feedback to the state level, these kind of coaches that would then support in turn the schools. And so they got regular support and problem solving among their cases through that process too. We had a number of graduate assistants involved, project staff, and some methodological consultants as well. So it was a great team. There were 2 primary questions we had associated with this research. The first was we were interested in the impact of this professional development with coaching. Again, it's focused on using data to drive decisions and implementing tier 2 interventions. Whether what was the impact on teachers and interventionists, their knowledge, their perceptions and their practices, and then we were also interested on the impact on students' early reading skill performance. So the participants, there were 61 schools that participated in this study. They came from 8 states in the Midwest and the Northeast. There were 206 homeroom teachers that participated. They were kindergarten through 3rd grade, and then interventionists that supported students in early reading in kindergarten through 3rd grade from those participating schools too. So there were 184 interventionists. Approximately 6,000 K through 3 students participated in the study, so we had a ton of data on student outcomes as well. Again, it was a randomized controlled trial, and within this study, schools were assigned at the school level to either receive our professional development or coaching, or they just did business as usual and they were a control school. The procedure for this involved the teachers and the interventionists in this professional development with coaching schools. Again, they participated in this on-site institute training and then that web facilitated coaching that took place from the coaches. The professional development focused on using data to drive instructional decisions as well as implementing kind of effective tier 2 reading interventions. The distance coaching occurred outside of classroom time for the teachers because we were mostly interested in supporting teachers and using data to drive instructional decisions. And then for the interventionists, we had an interesting approach. It was a bug in the ear type approach. And so what we did is we had, this was tier 2 interventions, so they were working with small groups of students. We set up a laptop back behind the students that would, and we had a webcam, and then there was a wireless earpiece that was in the interventionist ear. So they could see the coach and the coach could see them and they could give them real-time feedback during those intervention sessions, which was kind of neat. And then we were interested on the impact of that professional development with coaching. Again, we collected a number of different outcomes for both teachers and interventionists and then students as well. Yeah.
Did you have video or data on the ear and the bug in the ear? I mean, was there screen capture of the coach while this was happening, or some external video capturing the entire interaction?
Yeah, so we had both the coach and it was a headshot of the coach, and then it was the interventionist working with the students. You saw the back of the kids' heads, but we didn't have like voice to text or anything like that. But we did have, yeah, it was all encoded on the video, and then we went through and I'll talk about we did some coding in those video tapes as well. So we're interested in a number of different factors around teachers' interventionists. First, changes in their knowledge. And so we looked at their knowledge around database decision-making for reading. We developed an instrument to look at using data to drive instructional decisions on reading. And then we utilized Joanne Carla's measure of teaching knowledge of reading and reading practice. It's a pedagogical content knowledge measure of early reading she developed at the University of Michigan. And then we looked at teacher interventionist perceptions. We were interested in kind of their perceived importance around database decision-making in various aspects of reading instruction. And then we looked at their self-efficacy, their perceived skills in being able to implement database decision-making and being able to implement reading instructional components. Then we collected teacher logs, and nobody thought we could do this. And everybody's like, nobody's ever going to use this. It's never going to work. And it actually worked. And I'm always afraid to replicate this practice for fear that we won't get the kind of response we did from the study. But we had online logs that any time teachers made use of data on early reading to make any sort of decision about instruction or intervention, they notated in the logs. And we got folks that, we did have some incentives built in, but we had folks that agreed to do this, and we were able to capture this both on our treatment schools as well as control schools in terms of how they made use of data. So we were able to code, we had another rich data set there, able to code all the types of data they used and how they use those data to make decisions. We also video, as I mentioned, because all the coaching sessions were on video, we were able to videotape all those coaching sessions. But in addition to that, we had a select number of intervention sessions that we required interventions to record, videotape their sessions with students. That was independent of the coach being there. And so those intervention sessions were then videotaped and were coded as well for outcomes and teacher practice. We looked at student outcomes. We were interested in, many of our schools were already using Dibble's Next, which is a universal screener for early reading. Those that weren't were required to as participating in the study. Most of them were. So to look at students' performance relative to early reading skill benchmarks. And then we also collected data on the Woodcock-Johnson test of achievement for reading, the achievement test in the area of early reading, looking, and the Woodcock-Johnson is another thing that people didn't think we could do. We had, remember, we had close to 6,000 students participate in this. And so what we did is in those intervention groups, if there were more than 4 kids in the intervention group, we just randomly selected 4 to complete the Woodcock-Johnson. It was a resource issue. We couldn't get enough people in the schools to do this because those take a little bit of time. So we had to train our coaches first. Before we went about training folks in the schools, we had to train our coaches. And so the coaches received training in terms of the content focused on guidelines around database decision-making, how to use assessments to guide intervention, that and how to implement interventions from a toolkit. So I didn't mention the project itself had an intervention toolkit, a research-based tier 2 kind of reading interventions that were part of this process. And so the coaches were all well-versed and trained in use of those interventions in the toolkit as well. And we trained them during the summer prior to the study as well as during the school year and the following summer. We actually, this represented 3 cohorts. So there were 61 schools that were broken into kind of 3 cohorts of approximately 20 schools each over 3 years. This content training included a lot of opportunities for those of us that were trainers to do some modeling for those coaches, to give them opportunities to practice and role play things that they were going to be implementing with teachers and interventionists in their schools and receive feedback from those role plays. And because it was a randomized trial, the coaching support was really protocol driven. So we had really well operationalized protocols. We had a series of 8 sessions for teachers, 8 sessions for interventions they had to follow, and then some maintenance sessions they could include based on need. Those were all detailed protocols that we provided for those interactions. Those so we trained the coaches to use those protocols. They did role plays with each other, implementing those protocols to get practice, and we gave them feedback on how they were going to do that before they worked in schools. And then there were always opportunities with our coaches to engage in regular consultation. So we had regular consultation meetings that were every 2 weeks throughout the school year, where they would meet and talk about cases and analyze their cases and talk about next steps or to problem solve. But then we also had, as I mentioned, coaching consultants that would go in, and because all those coaching sessions were on video, and analyze their coaching sessions and give them direct feedback from their coaching sessions as well. So there was a lot of training for those full-time coaches. So what did the teachers get, and what did the interventionists get? So then the teachers, they received coaching. It was one-on-one. It was outside of class time. Yeah, it was outside of class time through our video conferencing. Again, it was protocol-driven. Each session with the teachers focused on using student data to inform instruction and intervention, using screening data to identify students who might need intervention, helping group students with common needs, implementing progress monitoring procedures to monitor their progress over time, and then helping determine students' response to intervention, students who are receiving intervention, whether they're responding or not. So the coaching sessions focused on those topics, and they included opportunities also for guided practice. So the coach would model database decisions for select students, and then have the teacher in turn practice making database decisions, and they give them feedback based on their use of those database decisions. Coaching for interventionists. It was also protocol driven. It involved this bug in the ear approach. It was unique to the study. We were excited about this approach. We'll see when we get to the outcomes. We found some good outcomes here, so hold on, we're almost there. It was a bug in the ear, and as I mentioned, the coaches, the interventionists would set up a laptop behind the students they were working with. The coaches could communicate with them through a bug in the ear. Not only could the coaches provide real-time feedback about the use of these research-based instructional practices, but they could also do some modeling for the interventionists as well. So they'd bring the laptop in front of the kids, and then the coach would actually implement the intervention with the kids and show the teacher how to do that. So it took a little bit of getting used to it. At the beginning, we had kids, you'd see their faces come in on the webcam, looking at, where are you? Who's in there? These are kindergarten through third graders. But over time, they became accustomed to that, so they were able to do some distance modeling with them as well. But the coaching sessions, they focused on the quality of intervention, the fidelity of the protocol, the use of those research-based practices I mentioned earlier. Add-in that we built into this was also around behavioral management. We found in our first year of implementing this project that the management issues became such in some of the classrooms. We had to build that in the intervention model. It was focused on early reading, and so they helped support them in managing students' behaviors. And then during each session, we always made sure that the coach offered some positive feedback about the session. They identified considerations for improvement, and then they modeled these suggestions for changes. And then they had a debriefing that followed those sessions, where they follow up with debriefing of additional things that the interventionists could work on. We're also coaching calls and emails to help facilitate this outside of those formalized meetings. Okay, so I'm trying to finish up here. So the research questions, again, we're interested in the impacts on teacher knowledge, perceptions, and practices, and on student outcomes. The approach we used the three-level, multi-level model. We were looking at time points within teachers, within schools. We're interested really in the differential rate of improvement between our treatment schools and our control schools. So what did we find? Okay, so we were interested first in terms of knowledge and beliefs of teachers and interventionists. We found that teachers who participated in professional development with coaching, that they had a greater increase in their database decision-making knowledge, how to make database decisions, as well as their perceived skills pertaining to database decision-making. So they had greater self-efficacy when it came to being able to make database decisions. Moderate effects to large effects there. And then we found that interventionists participating in professional development had a greater increase in their instructional knowledge than the controls, based on that pedagogical content knowledge measure. And they also had greater perceived skills pertaining to reading instruction. And so they had greater self-efficacy when it came to being able to provide effective reading intervention. With respect to their practices, teachers that participated in the professional development with coaching, my effect sizes are missing from this slide. These were actually some of the biggest effects, believe it or not, and I left them on the slide. I have to add that back in. Teachers participating in the PD exhibited greater database decision-making than the control teachers did based on those coded logs. So nobody said we could do it, but we had these online systems where we could go in and they'd log anytime they made database decisions. We found that they had more effective use of database decisions. They were all coded. We had a very detailed framework for coding all those database decisions making. They were coded by folks that were blind to the condition of those that were doing the database decisions. Again, teachers participating in the PD had greater database decision-making use. And then the interventionists participating in our coaching exhibited higher quality reading instructional practices. And that was based on coded video that we've done in those intervention sessions. Okay, so drum roll. What's the impact on students? Ultimately, we were most interested on this impacting students. If this didn't make any impacts on students, it would not have been worth our effort. So we were very happy to see that we saw some really promising outcomes in certain student outcomes. So again, we had Dibble's Next data that was collected in all the schools. That was that universal benchmark data that all the schools collected. For kindergarten, we found that students that were in those coached schools, that they performed better than controls at the end of the year on a measure of alphabetic principle and phonics, nonsense words on Dibble's Next. We weren't able to look at growth on Dibble's Next for kindergartners because they take different measures at different points in time of the year. But we were for first and second grade. So for first grade, we saw that students in those coached schools, that they had a greater increase in their alphabetic principle and phonics skills as measured through nonsense words as well. And that in grade 2 and 3, students in those coached teachers' classrooms, interventionist classrooms, had a greater increase in their oral reading fluency. So by second and third grade, we were interested in looking at their ability to fluently read connected text, and so oral reading fluency was an appropriate indicator there. So we were able to find some moderate to large effects on Dibble's Next. We then looked at the Woodcock-Johnson test of achievement. We found that students that were in those schools where coaching took place performed better than controls at the end of the year on letter, word identification, the Woodcock-Johnson test of achievement, as well as on word attack, which is a measure of phonics and structural analysis of words as well. So, and incidentally, this is one of a handful of studies that have been able to find moderate to large effects from Tier 2 reading intervention work. So we're very happy to be among those. These findings are really promising from this particular study. So I'm almost done. Take-home considerations. So some of the take-home considerations. So as you probably have hoped to be able to illustrate, implementation of MTSS in early reading is really complex. It's not a program, it's not a particular practice. There are a lot of components to it. It requires a lot of structured support. Providing job-embedded support in the form of coaching is something I've hoped to illustrate here and how we can do that with some of those aspects and components. This work is really hard. It is really hard. It takes a lot of time in building skills among educators and helping them communicate together and work through leadership teams in ways that are coordinated. And although our initial results are promising, and I think the results from this study we're really excited about the results, there's future work that's really needed to look at some of the moderating and mediating factors, the mechanisms that are responsible for some of the changes that we see in terms of teacher behaviors and practices in the classroom and student outcomes. So that's quick take-homes that I love here. So try to leave time now for the discussion. Again, if I will say that before we have questions and discussion, if anybody, I'm always interested in working with students. I do have a number of students doing their dissertation work with me or other projects with me too. There are always ongoing grant projects. So if you're interested in any of this or know students that are, please let me know. I'd be happy to engage them in this work too.
Thanks, Todd. Questions? Comments?
As far as the schools that have the coaching, was it like classroom by classroom, or did the whole school have the coaching and then another school wasn't controlled?
So yeah, that's a good question. So we had, within some of the schools, there were many classrooms that participated. Other schools may have only had a handful of classrooms based on interest among the teachers. To be participants, there had to be teachers that consented to participate along with interventionists that supported students in their classrooms. So in some of the schools, it was, let's say, a couple classrooms at each grade level. In other schools, it might have been more like 4 or 5 classrooms at each grade level.
And
So
the controls were at those schools too.
the controls were different schools. And so, which because while we initially have been nice, man, it would have been good if we could have done within school assignment, but because interventionists often move between classrooms, we really couldn't do assignment within schools. Yep. Yep.
I'm curious to hear your thoughts on parent involvement and if it's sort of like an implementation in isolation or if it's sort of, connected to the home. What was communicated to parents about?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, parents were informed but not terribly involved in the study. So I'd say for this particular study, there was parents were informed about their child's participation. That there would be those in their school using data to make decisions, and whether their child was selected to participate in intervention. The parent involvement piece is one. It's on a long list of follow-up work that I want to engage in. Prior to being here at Rutgers, I was at the University of Nebraska. I did a number of projects with Sue Sheridan, who's there, that does a lot of work in conjoint behavioral consultation, which is doing coaching work with teachers in tandem with parents. And so problem solving around kids with teachers and parents that are both present and getting that school-home continuity in place. And so it's on my list of things to do. I'm very interested in that case. That's a good question. Yeah.
Talk to me about the tier 2 interventions. Were there a lot? Do you know what they were? And how did they decide if they were going to change? Did they ever change from one intervention to another based on the data?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. It's a very good question. And so the interventions, they came, there was a combination of interventionists. There were some that used that were more kind of standard protocol interventions. It was like an intervention that was developed and had its own scope and sequence, so students would kind of place into them. We used, there were some that used early interventions in reading and sound partners at the time. Those have evolved now since the study. And then we had a number of individualized interventions that were from the Florida Center for Reading Research. They were the not student-directed interventions, they're the teacher-directed interventions that were compiled on work that was done there. It was Barbara Foreman and a lot of her work in building out a lot of these intervention toolkits. We utilized those as also for the individualized interventions. Yeah, good question. And there were changes. That's a very good question. So I didn't have much time to talk in detail, but what we would do during the institute trainings, we had kind of stations where they'd get to experience different interventions. They get to try them out. Their team members could say whether we wanted to do this. So we did have folks that would start with thinking they wanted to use certain interventions and then deciding to do some mid-course correction. Either didn't really emphasize the needs they had within their school, or it wasn't comfortable or consistent with the instructional practices that were occurring as part of their core instruction. So they made some mid-course corrections. There were some changes.
So the intervention selection was based on basically what the school thought was acceptable, or the teachers, or was it based on student need?
So their choice was they could choose from within the toolkit. They had to make sure, based on the needs that were identified with their students, that they had interventions that would cover the spectrum of needs that were identified for their students. But they had options within that, which interventions they could choose. So there was a lot of guidance provided by the coaches in terms of, as we analyze your data, these students are at the beginning of second grade, yet they have significant phonemic awareness skills concerns. And so we really need to focus on building our toolkit of phonemic awareness interventions that can be quick. By second grade, we shouldn't be spending a lot of time on this. We got to get them quickly in and out of intervention. And so they would help them focus kind of which interventions to use given the student's needs. But ultimately, it was up to school to decide among the menu of options which ones they chose. It's a good question. Yeah. Yep.
I'm curious if you looked at the effect size in relationship to contextual factors. So I assume there was a range of schools and students in terms of also how the schools thought about and used the interventionists, who the interventionists were in relationship to the teachers, and like all the contextual factors.
Right.
Did you see anything there in terms of how the effect sizes varied?
Yeah, so that work is still ongoing. There were some things we looked at. I will say the demographic characteristics were constrained in some ways for this project, in that as a priority for this grant, we prioritize rural schools, and that was part of, and so all the schools met the NCES criteria for being rural. And so, but there were variations in terms of socioeconomic and racial ethnic backgrounds of the students and the faculty that were at the schools. We haven't explored that so much. We did look at the intervention teacher relationships as a potential mediator. That did not pan out. So we weren't able to find that as a significant, by the way, everything I presented was statistically significant. I meant to mention that, but that didn't pan out as a statistically significant mediator in terms of the relationship between the condition and implementation within the classroom. But there are others that I'm hopeful I can get more students involved to mine some of this for dissertation work, because I think there are a lot. We collected a lot. We have demographic information on the faculty that were involved, on the students. We didn't have, although we intended, we didn't have good data in terms of students with IEPs versus non-IEPs. That was one thing that, in retrospect, I wish I'd gotten. The schools, while we'd hoped to get it as part of the DIBELS data, and the DIBELS database allowed for, none of them entered the data, so it wasn't there. So that made things a little challenging. So there were some factors that weren't there, but that is an area I'm really interested in, the mediators and moderators of this process. What are those contextual factors that really contribute to our observed findings? And we haven't quite gotten there yet. Good question. Do you have any you suggest or are excited about that would be good to think about?
No, I just think it'd be really interesting to know, does this work better in some places than in others?
Yeah.
It's great effect sizes, but.
Yeah.
Also, I have two other questions, but I don't want to.
Go ahead.
Sure.
Okay,
so it seems that you made certain assumptions about the role of the teacher and the role of the interventionist in terms of the training you gave them.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about what it means to make those assumptions in terms of what you got in the end?
Yeah. It was a compromise in this project, and we really wanted to try to standardize the protocol so we could say we know exactly the coaching that took place, and so we could make inferences from what occurred. And this particular study, it was more narrowly focused on providing support for teachers and interventions, whereas the other work I do, as I illustrated, has to do with a lot of leadership teams and different stakeholders within the school. We made a decision early on that the teachers would be involved in helping make adjustments to core instruction and database decisions, and the interventionists would focus exclusively on implementing those tier 2 interventions. That was an assignment. I mean, we narrowed the definition of what the coaching would involve to that, and I think in the real world, different schools may have different roles for those individuals, and in fact, the interventionists themselves had different roles within the school. So some of them were reading specialists, some of them were special educators. We had school psychologists that provided intervention. There was a variety of backgrounds they had in there. And so along with those roles, they had other responsibilities that we really didn't entertain within kind of this randomized trial. But it's a good point in that I think we made some decisions in how we focus the coaching for those different stakeholders.
That would be an interesting moderator to look at.
It would be,
The
yes.
role of the interventionist. Who is the interventionist?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
did it make a difference what their training was?
Yeah.
So my question, I may have missed this because I came in late, but when you consented, did you consent at student level? In other words, did everyone in the classroom consent to participate in the study, or at teacher level?
So we were able, because none of the coaches, because there was a piece of the project where the coaches would directly be working with students through that modeling that I described, that required explicit consent from parents. Parents of children who were selected for intervention had to indicate complete consent in terms of whether or not it explained in full detail the types of interventions, what would be offered, what their child would be doing, that we'd be videotaping, and how to be using for research. But aside from that, it was a process by which people were informed and they could opt out. And so they were given an option of, there were letters sent home to parents explaining the study and what it involved. There was database decision making, that their teachers and interventionists would be receiving outside support from these university coaches, what that would entail, and if they did not want to have their child participate, they could opt out.
So that's something I always think about in my work in schools, is if we're only providing interventions to students whose parents provide consent. So when you're talking about parent relationships, we're missing something there. I mean, somehow that's a moderator too, because if the kids that their parents said no, that would be interesting.
That's interesting.
Look at it.
Yeah, and it was a little more nuanced. That's a very good point. That's a very good point, because there is some sort of selection bias going on there in terms of who's brought into the study. But I think there's a little more nuance in that they could still receive intervention without explicit consent. But for them to be videotaped and be part of those sessions, we had to flag students that did not, whose parents did not consent to that process. But aside from that, there were database decisions that being made for students and their placement intervention that could have been influenced by parents opting out. That's a good point.
One more question.
Yeah.
So did you fade coaching at any point, or did they coach the entire time?
I wish so, man. We were scrambling. It was 5-year IES funding. We scrambled right up to the end to get the data collection. I would have liked to have some sort of data on how this was maintained over time. What's that?
Maybe it's follow-up.
Yes, it's a good follow-up. Exactly. Exactly.
The same people.
Exactly.
Okay,
Yeah, I have a
one
really
quick question for me and then we'll close.
Yeah.
Was there any difference between the intervention and control groups in the criteria or the profile of students in Tier 2?
What we did is, in terms of the student outcomes, the students, and I didn't describe this, it's a very good question. In terms of how we identified students to track for student outcomes, it was students that fell below benchmark expectation on that Devil's Next. And so in the control group, they may or may not have been receiving intervention. So we don't have that piece, and that's another follow-up piece. I do have the data on whether they received intervention, and that's a very good another disaggregating the data based on whether they received intervention.
Okay, thank you very much. And next week we have our own Eugenia Etkina and Josh Rutherford.